I can't imagine that. It's just crazy because it's like, hey, you brought her into this world and you took her out.
During the early hours on May 11th, police say they got a call from Natavia Sanders saying her mother had strangled her.
A voice broke the silence with a desperate call for help. The dispatcher worked quickly to understand what was happening and keep the caller talking. Then, without warning, the line went silent.
Jamarcus Hudley works in the area and says earlier that day Sylvius was acting strange.
Yeah, very weird, like out of ordinary. She was like outside screaming. Most definitely how she was acting. I felt like either the mom was gonna get hurt or she was gonna hurt someone else. I didn't think she was gonna hurt her own family.
The caller was 18-year-old Natavia Sanders, a recent arrival from Erie, Pennsylvania, where she had already completed the requirements for graduation and was preparing to begin a new chapter of her life in Florida. Within minutes, Tampa police were racing toward a quiet residential street with only fragments of information and no clear picture of what awaited them. From the outside, the home appeared calm. There were no obvious signs of the emergency described over the phone, but officers knew that unanswered calls like this could change everything. Every passing moment increased the urgency as they worked to determine whether someone inside was still waiting for help. What they encountered that morning would become the beginning of a complex homicide investigation. As detectives carefully reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that not every account of what had happened aligned with the evidence. Those first critical minutes would shape every step that followed and leave investigators searching for answers that extended far beyond a single emergency call.
She was medicated here, and we thought that her movement would have her a better start, but sometimes people need their medicine in order to function, and a lot of people don't take that serious. And I do wish that Florida does find ways to help people more with mental health, not with welfare, food stamps, cash, with medical, so they can keep surviving and keep raising beautiful children. This is tragic, and it happened through mental health untreated.
Before we go any further, if you believe victims deserve to be remembered for the lives they lived, not just the headlines they leave behind, please subscribe to Darkness Protocol. Every subscription, every like, and every share helps us continue researching real cases and ensuring that people like Natavia Sanders are never forgotten. Now, let's go back to where this story truly began. Before her name appeared in headlines, Natavia Sanders was an 18-year-old preparing for one of the biggest milestones of her life. Friends, classmates, and educators knew her as a young woman standing on the threshold of adulthood, with high school behind her and a new chapter waiting to begin. Natavia spent much of her childhood in Erie, Pennsylvania, where she attended local public schools. According to educators who remembered her, she was respectful, well-behaved, and consistently made positive impressions in the classroom. One moment, in particular, stood out. Through her conduct at school, she earned enough positive behavior points to be selected as Principal for a Day, a recognition reserved for students who demonstrated responsibility and leadership. Years later, that achievement would still be remembered by school staff. By the time she turned 18, Natavia had already completed the academic requirements needed to graduate from high school. It was an accomplishment that reflected years of steady effort and placed her on the verge of beginning a new stage of life. Not long afterward, Natavia relocated with her family from Erie to Tampa, Florida. The move represented a significant change for the household, leaving behind familiar schools, teachers, and friends to begin again in a different city. When news of what had happened reached Erie, the loss was deeply felt. Former teachers, classmates, and school leaders remembered not only the student they had known, but also the young woman whose future had seemed full of promise. At her graduation ceremony, her name was honored alongside the rest of her class, a quiet reminder that, although her journey had been cut short, she had not been forgotten. For Natavia and her family, the move to Florida was meant to mark a fresh beginning. Instead, it became the setting for a case that would soon draw the attention of investigators and leave two communities searching for answers. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Natavia Sanders was living with her mother, Rotisha Silvius, and her younger siblings in Tampa, Florida. The family had recently relocated from Erie, Pennsylvania, leaving behind the community where Natavia had spent most of her childhood. Public records do not fully explain what prompted the move, but it marked a significant transition for everyone in the household.
It took me by surprise, to be honest. I never really thought, no one would think nothing would ever happen like that. But yeah, since I've been here, it wasn't nothing. Didn't hear any screaming or no fight or anything.
Much of what occurred inside the home remains known only through the investigation that followed. There are no verified reports showing a long history of public conflict between Natavia and her mother before the family's move. For that reason, it is important to separate documented facts from later speculation. Court records filed after the incident indicate that Rotisha Silvius had a documented history of mental health concerns. Those records also reference questions about whether she had been consistently taking prescribed medication in the period before the incident. Those issues later became relevant during court proceedings, but at the time, they were not widely known outside the family. One documented event stood out. On the evening before the emergency call, a person in the neighborhood became concerned after observing Rotisha's behavior outside the residence and contacted law enforcement. Officers responded, assessed the situation, and eventually left. Less than a day later, emergency responders would return to the same address under far different circumstances, setting in motion an investigation that would soon attract widespread attention. The final days before the emergency call can only be reconstructed through documented witness accounts, police records, and information later presented in court. While many questions remain unanswered, the available timeline provides important context for what unfolded. There is no verified evidence that the family drew significant public attention in the days immediately before the incident. By all outward appearances, life at the Tampa residence continued without any widely reported disturbances. That changed on the evening before the emergency call. According to investigative records, a man working in the neighborhood noticed Rotisha Silvius outside the home, behaving in a way that concerned him. Believing something was not right, he contacted the Tampa Police Department and requested officers.
Jamarcus Hudley works in the area and says earlier that day Silvius was acting strange.
Yeah, very weird, like out of ordinary. She was like outside screaming. Most definitely how she was out there, I felt like either the mom was going to get hurt or she was going to hurt someone else. I didn't think she was going to hurt her own family.
Hudley says there was a huge police presence lining the street.
You could not get from right there to right there. You could not cross right here.
Police say they tried to give Sanders CPR after finding her on the kitchen floor, unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital where she died on May 13th. Silvius' charges have been upgraded to first-degree murder.
It took me by surprise, to be honest. I never really thought, no one would think nothing would ever happen like that. But yeah, since I've been here, it wasn't.
Conduct a welfare check. Responding officers arrived, assessed the situation, and spoke with those at the residence. Based on what they observed at that time, no enforcement action was taken, and they eventually left the scene. That encounter would later become an important part of the timeline. It established that law enforcement had been called to the same address less than 24 hours before the emergency that would follow. As night turned into morning, nothing publicly suggested that another call for service would soon be placed from that home. Yet within hours, events inside the residence would take an unexpected turn, transforming what had begun as an isolated welfare concern into a major criminal investigation. The morning began with a call that immediately raised concern inside the Emergency Communications Center. A young woman reached a 911 dispatcher and reported that she had been assaulted inside her home. The dispatcher worked to gather critical information, confirm the address, and keep the caller engaged while help was sent. Before the conversation could continue, the call was unexpectedly disconnected. Treating the situation as a potential life-threatening emergency, the dispatcher relayed the information to Tampa police. Patrol officers were immediately assigned and responded without delay, knowing they had only limited details about what might be unfolding inside the residence. Within minutes, officers arrived at the address. They approached the home, announced their presence, and repeatedly knocked on the front door. Despite their efforts, no one answered. As they remained outside, they observed lights inside the home turning on and off and noticed movement that suggested people were still inside. Those observations heightened their concern that someone could be in immediate need of assistance. Officers continued calling out, identifying themselves, and requesting that whoever was inside come to the door. When those efforts failed, they were forced to make a difficult decision based on the information available to them. Believing there could be an active medical emergency, they made entry into the home to conduct a welfare check. Inside, officers quickly located the young woman who had placed the emergency call. They immediately requested emergency medical personnel and began providing aid while additional officers secured the scene. Paramedics arrived within moments, took over medical care, and transported Natavia Sanders to Tampa General Hospital for emergency treatment. For the first responders, the priority had been clear from the moment they arrived: preserve life and stabilize the situation. At that point, they still did not know exactly what had taken place inside the home. That responsibility would soon shift from emergency responders to investigators, who now faced the task of determining how an ordinary morning had escalated into a case that demanded far more than a routine emergency response. As emergency medical crews focused on saving Natavia Sanders, the responsibility inside the home shifted to investigators. What had begun as an emergency response was now being treated as a potential homicide investigation. Every decision from that point forward followed established investigative procedure, with one objective: determine exactly what had happened inside the residence. The first priority was securing the scene. Officers restricted access to the home, ensuring that no one entered or left without authorization. Investigators carefully documented the layout of the residence, recorded observations, and began preserving anything that could help establish an accurate timeline. At the same time, officers separated the people who had been inside the home so that each account could be documented independently. That step is standard practice in major investigations and helps detectives compare statements for consistency. Detectives also revisited the sequence of events that had unfolded only hours earlier. The emergency call was reviewed alongside dispatch records, officer radio traffic, and body-worn camera footage. Those records allowed investigators to reconstruct the response minute by minute, from the moment the 911 call was received to the arrival of officers and the emergency medical response that followed. Rather than relying on a single witness, detectives compared multiple independent sources to establish the most reliable timeline. Investigators also examined the welfare check conducted at the same address the previous evening. By comparing that earlier police response with the events of the following morning, detectives worked to determine whether there had been warning signs that later became significant. Witness interviews, officer observations, and the chronology of police contacts were all reviewed as part of that assessment. While Natavia remained hospitalized, investigators continued gathering evidence and consulting medical professionals. 2 days later, after she died from her injuries, the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner ruled her death a homicide. That official determination became a pivotal development in the investigation. Detectives concluded that the medical findings, when considered alongside witness statements, the emergency call, and evidence collected during the investigation, supported a more serious criminal charge. On the 24th of May 2024, the charge against Rotisha Silvius was upgraded to first-degree murder, reflecting the evidence investigators had assembled during the course of the case. As detectives continued assembling evidence, the investigation quickly moved from an emergency response to a criminal prosecution. Based on the information gathered during the initial investigation, Rotisha Silvius was taken into custody and booked into the Hillsborough County Jail. Prosecutors initially filed charges connected to the assault on Natavia Sanders while she remained hospitalized. 2 days later, after Natavia died from her injuries, investigators consulted with the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner and reviewed the findings alongside witness interviews and other evidence collected during the investigation. Following that review, prosecutors upgraded the case, charging Silvius with first-degree murder. Authorities stated that the decision reflected the evidence developed during the investigation rather than any single piece of information. As the case entered the court system, defense attorneys raised questions about Silvius's mental condition. Court records show that the judge ordered competency evaluations to determine whether she was legally capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting in her own defense. Those evaluations are a standard legal safeguard and do not determine guilt or innocence. During subsequent hearings, prosecutors continued presenting the procedural steps necessary to move the case forward, while the defense addressed competency-related issues before the court. Based on publicly available information, the criminal case has not yet reached a public trial, verdict, or sentencing. The proceedings remain subject to the court's schedule and any further competency findings before the case can advance. For Natavia's family, however, the legal process represented only one part of a much larger journey. While the courts worked through the case, two communities continued remembering the young woman whose life had ended far too soon. As the legal process moved forward, another story unfolded far from the courtroom. In Erie, Pennsylvania, the city where Natavia Sanders had spent much of her childhood, news of her death reached the schools and educators who had known her long before her move to Florida. For many, the headlines were difficult to reconcile with the quiet, respectful student they remembered. Former teachers spoke of a young woman who consistently carried herself with maturity and kindness in the classroom. School administrators recalled that Natavia had once been selected as principal for a day, an honor earned through positive behavior and leadership. It was a recognition that reflected the impression she left on those around her long before her name became associated with a criminal case. Natavia had already completed the academic requirements for graduation before relocating to Tampa. When graduation season arrived, her former school community made sure she was not forgotten. During the ceremony, educators recognized her alongside her classmates, allowing her name to remain part of the graduating class she had worked toward joining. It was a simple but meaningful tribute to a future that had been interrupted far too soon. Friends, classmates, and members of the community also shared messages of remembrance, reflecting on the life Natavia had lived rather than the circumstances that ended it. Their focus was not on the headlines, but on the young woman they had known before the case drew national attention. For those who remembered her best, Natavia Sanders would always be more than the subject of a criminal investigation. She was a daughter, a classmate, a student, and a young woman whose life had only just begun. That is the legacy her community chose to preserve. Today, the criminal case against Rotisha Silvius remains part of the judicial process. While investigators completed their work and prosecutors filed the charges they believed were supported by the evidence, the court must still determine the final legal outcome through the procedures required by law. As with every criminal case, the judicial process is intended to ensure that the evidence is examined fairly before any final judgment is reached. Although many of the questions surrounding this case have been addressed through the investigation, others may only be answered as the legal proceedings continue. For Natavia Sanders' family, her friends, and the communities that knew her in both Erie and Tampa, no courtroom decision can replace the future she was preparing to begin. Cases like Natavia's remind us that every headline represents a real person with dreams, relationships, and a life that mattered long before national attention arrived. Remembering that person, not simply the crime, is what gives these stories lasting meaning.
Thank you for watching this documentary. If Natavia's story moved you, consider leaving a respectful comment, sharing your thoughts, or expressing support for everyone affected by this case. Conversations grounded in compassion and respect help keep the focus where it belongs. If you appreciate carefully researched, fact-based true crime documentaries that prioritize accuracy over speculation and honor the lives behind the headlines, consider subscribing to Darkness Protocol. Your support helps us continue telling these stories responsibly, ensuring that victims like Natavia Sanders are remembered not just for how their lives ended, but for who they were.